Hello everyone. Tonight I want you to imagine something for a moment. The sun has just disappeared beyond the hills of a medieval town. The market stalls are empty, the city gates are closing, and one by one the lights inside the houses fade away. Now imagine that you are still outside walking through streets swallowed by darkness, where every sound echoes and every shadow feels alive. Why were people so afraid to be outside after dark in medieval times? And what could actually happen if you were caught wandering the streets at night? Tonight, we'll slowly step into that quiet, mysterious world together. So settle in, relax, and let the story carry you through the darkness. In medieval times, darkness changed the entire rhythm of life. Once the sun dipped below the horizon, the world outside became a very different place, and most people preferred to stay indoors. Villages, towns, and small cities had little to no street lighting. The only sources of light were candles, oil lamps, or torches, and these were usually kept inside homes because they were expensive and also dangerous. Fire was one of the greatest threats in medieval settlements, where buildings were often made of wood and thatch. Because of this, streets after dark were often completely black, with only the faint glow of light leaking from shuttered windows. If you happened to be outside after dark, you would quickly realize that the environment had transformed from a familiar daytime setting into something uncertain and unsettling. The absence of light meant that navigation became difficult. Roads were uneven, muddy, and full of obstacles such as animal waste, loose stones, and open drainage ditches. Without the ability to see clearly, people risked tripping, falling, or injuring themselves. A simple walk through a village could turn hazardous. Travelers moving between towns faced even greater dangers because rural roads often passed through forests or isolated countryside. These areas were known for bandits and highway robbers who used the cover of darkness to ambush travelers. If someone was caught outside after dark on a lonely road, they might become an easy target for theft or violence. Even within towns, being outside late at night could bring suspicion. Medieval communities were tight-knit and cautious about strangers or unusual behavior. If someone was wandering around after dark without a clear reason, neighbors might assume that the person had dishonest intentions. Theft, arson, and burglary were real concerns, and nighttime was when such crimes were most likely to occur. Because of this, many towns established curfews. Bells were often rung in the evening to signal the end of the working day and the beginning of the night curfew. After this time, residents were expected to return home and close their doors. The very word curfew comes from a medieval practice related to fire safety. In some places, a bell known as the curfew bell was rung to remind people to cover or extinguish their hearth fires before going to sleep. Fires left unattended could easily spread through densely packed wooden houses and destroy entire neighborhoods. But the curfew bell also had a social function. It marked the time when most activity in the streets should stop. Once the bell rang, the expectation was that people would stay indoors unless they had a legitimate reason to be outside. Night watchmen played an important role in maintaining order during these hours. Many towns hired watchmen who patrolled the streets through the night, carrying lanterns or torches. Their job was to keep an eye out for suspicious activity, fires, or disturbances. They might call out the hour or check that doors and gates were properly secured. If they encountered someone walking around after curfew, They would likely question that person. Travellers, merchants arriving late, or messengers might be allowed to continue. But anyone without a clear explanation could be detained or escorted away. City gates were another important factor. Most medieval towns were surrounded by walls for protection, and these walls had gates that controlled entry and exit. During the day, the gates were open to allow trade and movement, but at night they were closed and guarded. If someone arrived after the gates were shut, they might be forced to wait outside until morning. This could be extremely uncomfortable and sometimes dangerous, especially during cold weather or in regions where wild animals were common. Darkness also heightened people's fears and imagination. Medieval society had a strong belief in supernatural forces, and nighttime was often associated with spirits, demons, and other unknown dangers. Stories about ghosts, witches, and wandering creatures were widely shared, and these beliefs made people even more reluctant to travel after sunset. Forests, crossroads, and abandoned places were thought to be particularly risky locations once darkness fell. Even if these fears were based on folklore rather than real threats, they influenced how people behaved and how safe they felt. For travellers on long journeys, inns and taverns were essential. People tried to plan their routes so they could reach a place to stay before nightfall. Inns offered food, warmth, and a relatively safe place to sleep. Arriving after dark could mean missing the opportunity to secure a room or even being turned away if the doors had already been closed. This meant that many travellers pushed themselves to reach the next village or inn before the sun disappeared. In rural areas, nighttime carried additional risks from animals. Wolves and other predators still existed in parts of medieval Europe, and while attacks on humans were not common, the possibility added to the sense of danger. Livestock owners were careful to bring animals into secure enclosures before nightfall to prevent them from being attacked. People walking alone at night through fields or forests would have been very aware of the sounds around them, listening for movement that might signal a threat. Weather conditions also made nighttime travel more difficult. Without modern roads or reliable lighting, rain could turn paths into slippery mud, and fog could reduce visibility even further. In winter, the combination of darkness and cold could be harsh and exhausting. A traveller caught outside during a storm or freezing night might struggle to find shelter. Social life did exist after dark, but it was usually limited to specific places such as taverns, religious gatherings, or special events. Even then, people typically stayed close to home. The idea of casually wandering through town late at night, as many people do today, would have been unusual for most medieval residents. Daily life followed the rhythm of the sun. Work began early in the morning and ended near sunset. If someone was found outside at night behaving suspiciously, the consequences could sometimes be serious. Authorities might assume involvement in criminal activity. Punishments in medieval societies could be harsh, and even minor offences might result in fines or public punishment. This encouraged people to avoid situations that could attract suspicion. Another reason people avoided the streets after dark was the lack of organized emergency services. If something went wrong, an injury, an attack, or even getting lost, there was little help available. Medical care was limited and travelling alone at night meant relying entirely on personal caution and luck. The experience of nighttime in medieval times was therefore very different from the modern world. Today, cities are brightly lit, transportation runs through the night, and people move freely at all hours. In contrast, medieval communities were structured around daylight. Darkness signalled the end of activity, the closing of gates, and the retreat into homes for safety and rest. Being outside after dark did not automatically mean something terrible would happen, but it placed a person in an environment where risks were higher and protection was limited. Between the darkness, the suspicion of authorities, the possibility of criminals, and the challenges of navigation, nighttime streets were places most people preferred to avoid. As a result, when evening arrived, and the curfew bell echoed through narrow streets and wooden houses, families closed their shutters, secured their doors, and settled inside, leaving the silent roads to the watchman, the occasional traveller, and the deep, uncertain quiet of the medieval night. As the night deepened in medieval times, the outside world became quieter, but also more tense. Sound travelled differently in the stillness of darkness. The clatter of footsteps on stone, the creaking of wooden carts, or the distant bark of a dog could echo through narrow streets and alleyways. Because most people were indoors, any unusual noise outside would quickly attract attention. If someone was moving around after dark, especially in a town where everyone knew each other, that person's presence would not go unnoticed. A late walker might hear shutters open slightly as curious residents tried to see who was passing by. In some places, people might even call out from windows asking who was there, particularly if the hour was late and the streets were supposed to be empty. For someone unfamiliar with the area, nighttime could feel disorienting. Medieval towns were often built with winding streets, irregular layouts, and narrow alleys that twisted between houses. During the day, these paths might seem lively and easy to navigate, but at night they could feel confusing and claustrophobic. Without proper lighting, even familiar routes could become difficult to follow. A person could easily turn down the wrong lane or end up at a dead end against a town wall. Lanterns were sometimes carried by travellers, but these produced only a small circle of light, leaving most of the surroundings hidden in shadow. The darkness also changed how people perceived danger. In daylight, threats could usually be seen and avoided. At night, the unknown itself became frightening. Shadows cast by a torch could stretch and shift across the ground, creating shapes that looked almost alive. Wind moving through wooden signs or loose shutters could produce eerie sounds. Even animals such as cats or dogs moving quietly through the streets might startle someone walking alone. The human imagination filled the gaps created by darkness, which is one reason medieval stories often connected nighttime with mysterious or supernatural events. As the night stretched further into the early hours, the medieval world often felt almost suspended in time. The bustle and noise of daytime life, markets shouting with traders, blacksmiths, hammering metal, children running through narrow streets, completely disappeared. What remained was a deep silence, broken only by occasional sounds. The slow footsteps of a night watchman, the distant howl of a dog, or the rustling of wind through wooden rooftops. If someone happened to be outside during these hours, the stillness could feel both peaceful and unsettling at the same time. One of the most noticeable differences between medieval nights and modern nights was the complete absence of artificial light across large areas. Today, even small towns glow with electric lamps, but medieval settlements were surrounded by vast darkness. Once you stepped away from the immediate light of a torch or lantern, the world quickly faded into shadow. On clear nights, the moon and stars provided some illumination, and people relied heavily on moonlight when travelling after sunset. A full moon could make roads faintly visible and allow travellers to move with more confidence. But on cloudy nights or during the new moon, the darkness could become almost absolute. Because of this, people developed a strong awareness of natural light cycles. Many activities were planned around the phases of the moon. Merchants, farmers, and travellers sometimes scheduled journeys during brighter nights to reduce risk. Moonlit travel was far safer than attempting to move through forests or open countryside in complete darkness. The glow of the moon reflecting on rivers or roads could guide travellers when landmarks were difficult to see. In towns and cities, the design of buildings added to the sense of confinement after dark. Streets were often very narrow, with houses leaning inward from both sides. Upper floors sometimes extended over the street, making passages even tighter. During the day, these streets were crowded with life, but at night they could feel like tunnels of darkness. A person carrying a lantern might see only a few feet ahead, while the rest of the street remained hidden. Another important element of nighttime life was the closing of businesses and workshops. Medieval economies depended heavily on daylight. Craftsmen such as blacksmiths, carpenters, and weavers typically stopped working once natural light faded. Artificial lighting was expensive and weak, making detailed work difficult. As a result, most trades operated strictly during daylight hours. When evening arrived, workshops were locked, tools were put away, and workers returned home. For the rare individuals still outside, there was always the possibility of being stopped by local authorities. Town officials took nighttime security seriously because fires and crimes could devastate entire communities. Watchmen, or guards, might demand to know a person's name, purpose, and destination. Carrying identification in the modern sense did not exist, so travellers often relied on letters of passage, merchant permits, or simply convincing explanations. If someone could not explain their presence convincingly, they might be detained until morning. Fires were perhaps the greatest fear during the night. In medieval settlements, buildings were tightly packed and often constructed from timber with straw roofs. A single spark from a candle or cooking hearth could ignite a blaze that spread rapidly from house to house. Because everyone was asleep during the night, a fire might grow large before being noticed. This is one reason why watchmen frequently checked for smoke or flames during their patrols. If a fire started, they would shout loudly through the streets to wake residents and organize efforts to extinguish it. Water buckets, wells, and barrels were often kept ready for emergencies, but fighting a fire in the dark was extremely challenging. Without modern equipment, people relied on human chains passing buckets of water from wells or rivers to the burning area. The darkness made it harder to see flames clearly and coordinate efforts. Entire neighborhoods could be destroyed within hours if a fire grew out of control. The emotional atmosphere of nighttime also shaped medieval culture and storytelling. Many legends and folk tales were connected with darkness. People believed that certain supernatural forces were more active after sunset. Stories about wandering spirits, enchanted creatures, or cursed places were commonly shared around hearth fires. Whether people truly believed these tales or simply enjoyed them as stories, they added another layer of caution to nighttime behavior. Churches and monasteries also followed strict routines during the night. Monks often woke at specific hours for prayer services known as vigils or matins. While most townspeople slept, monks gathered in dimly lit chapels to pray and chant. The quiet voices echoing through stone corridors created a solemn atmosphere. In this sense, night was not only a time of danger or rest, but also a time for spiritual reflection. Another group that sometimes worked during the night were bakers. Bread was a daily necessity, and preparing it required many hours. Bakers often began their work before dawn so fresh loaves could be ready for the morning market. Their ovens glowed in the darkness while the rest of the town slept. The smell of baking bread drifting through empty streets could be one of the few signs of life during the early hours. For travelers crossing long distances, nighttime could be mentally exhausting. Walking or riding in darkness required constant attention. A horse might stumble on uneven ground, or a wagon wheel might break on a hidden stone. Even when no immediate danger appeared, the strain of moving through uncertain terrain could wear down a traveller's nerves. Many preferred to stop early and rest, rather than risk continuing after sunset. Military activity sometimes took advantage of darkness as well. Armies occasionally moved or attacked at night to surprise enemies. However, night operations were difficult, because coordination was limited, and soldiers could easily become separated from their units. Torches used for visibility also revealed positions to opponents. Because of these difficulties, nighttime military actions were usually reserved for special situations. Weather conditions made the experience even more unpredictable. Strong winds could extinguish torches, plunging someone into sudden darkness. Heavy rain might soak clothing and make paths slippery. Fog could roll in and obscure landmarks entirely. A traveller who lost their sense of direction in such conditions might wander for hours before finding shelter. Despite these challenges, medieval nights were not always filled with fear. On calm evenings with a bright moon, the landscape could appear strangely beautiful. Fields and rivers reflected soft silver light, and the sky was filled with stars far more visible than in modern cities. People living in that era were deeply familiar with the night sky, using constellations to orient themselves during travel. Still, the overwhelming reality was that nighttime marked the boundary between safety and uncertainty. The structures of medieval society, curfews, closed gates, night watches, and communal routines, were all designed to reduce the risks that darkness brought. When someone stepped outside after dark, they entered a world that felt less controlled and less predictable than the daytime environment. For most people, the safest and most comfortable choice was simply to remain indoors. Homes provided warmth, light, and protection. Families gathered around hearth fires, shared simple meals, and prepared for sleep while the outside world fell quiet. As the hours passed and the first faint hint of dawn appeared on the horizon, the tension of night slowly faded. When the sun finally rose, gates opened, workshops came alive again, and the streets filled with voices and movement. The return of daylight restored the sense of normal life that darkness had temporarily taken away. In this daily cycle, medieval people learned to respect the night, not as a time for endless activity, but as a period when caution, rest, and patience were necessary until morning arrived. As the hours moved closer toward midnight, the medieval landscape often felt completely abandoned by ordinary life. What little movement still existed gradually faded away until even the occasional traveller or watchman became rare. In many towns, the darkness between midnight and dawn was considered the deepest and most uncertain part of the night. At this time, almost every household was asleep. Fires were reduced to glowing embers, and the only light visible in the streets might come from a single lantern carried by a guard making slow rounds through the town. For someone standing outside during these late hours, the silence could feel overwhelming. Unlike modern environments where distant traffic or city noise is constant, medieval nights could be almost completely quiet. This silence often amplified every small sound. The creak of a wooden sign swinging in the wind, the scratching of a rat near a wall, or the shifting of a horse in a stable could sound surprisingly loud in the empty streets. Anyone walking outside would become highly aware of their surroundings, because even their own footsteps seemed to echo through the darkness. One of the greatest concerns during these hours was the possibility of theft or burglary. Most homes stored their valuable belongings directly inside: coins, tools, clothing, or food supplies. Locks existed, but were not always highly secure, and windows were often protected only by shutters. Because of this, thieves sometimes attempted to move quietly through neighborhoods at night looking for opportunities. They might try to open poorly secured doors or climb through windows. As the final hours of the night approached, the medieval world remained wrapped in a quiet that modern people rarely experience. The period just before dawn was often the coldest and most still time of the entire night. If someone happened to be outside during these hours, they might feel the chill settling deeply into the air, especially in stone-built towns where cold winds moved easily through narrow streets. Fires inside homes had usually burned low, and only a faint glow might escape through small cracks in shutters or door frames. For a person outside, visibility was still limited, but the darkness began to change slightly as the sky slowly lightened. The horizon might develop a faint grey or pale blue tone long before the sun actually appeared. This gradual return of light was important because it signalled that the long hours of uncertainty were almost over. Many medieval people woke early, so the first signs of dawn often brought the first hints of movement in towns and villages. Before that moment, however, the night could feel endless. If a traveller had been walking for hours, exhaustion would begin to set in. Roads that had seemed manageable earlier might now feel longer and more confusing. Without clear landmarks visible, judging distance or direction was difficult. Someone might walk slowly, conserving energy and listening carefully for signs of human settlement, such as a rooster crowing or the distant sound of a church bell. The crowing of roosters was one of the earliest signals that morning was approaching. In villages where chickens were common, the first rooster calls could echo through the quiet streets long before sunrise. These sounds served almost like natural alarms, gradually waking the community. For someone outside during the night, hearing the first rooster might bring relief because it meant daylight was not far away. Another group that sometimes appeared in the streets during these early hours were workers who needed to begin their tasks before sunrise. Bakers, for example, often started their work in the middle of the night so that bread would be ready by morning. Their ovens required time to heat, and their dough required careful preparation. As dawn approached, the warm smell of fresh bread might drift quietly through otherwise empty streets. In port towns or settlements near rivers, fishermen sometimes prepared their boats before the sun rose. They moved quietly toward the water carrying nets or tools, hoping to begin their work as soon as daylight allowed them to see properly. These early workers were among the few people who regularly experienced the last moments of night outside. For travelers approaching a town at this time, the sight of walls or buildings slowly emerging from the darkness could feel like a great relief. The outline of towers, church steeples, or city gates would gradually become visible against the brightening sky. If the gates had been closed during the night, travelers might wait nearby until guards opened them in the morning. As soon as the gates opened, merchants, farmers, and other travelers would begin entering the town to start their day. Inside the town, households slowly came back to life. People stirred from sleep, rekindled their fires, and prepared simple morning meals. Doors opened, and the first conversations of the day began in quiet voices. The watchmen who had spent the entire night walking through the streets could finally finish their duties and return home to rest. For someone who had remained outside all night, the return of daylight brought a sense of safety and normality. What had seemed threatening in darkness now appeared ordinary again. The same streets that had been shadowy and silent during the night, filled with movement and familiar sounds. Vendors prepared market stalls, craftsmen unlocked their workshops, and children began running through the streets. This daily transformation from night to day was deeply ingrained in medieval life. People understood that darkness was a temporary condition, but during those hours it changed how society functioned. Activity slowed, caution increased, and most individuals retreated indoors where light and warmth provided security. Being outside after dark did not automatically mean that something terrible would happen, but it placed a person in an environment where many of the usual protections of society were reduced. Streets were poorly lit, travel was difficult, and strangers were treated with suspicion. Authorities enforced curfews, town gates were closed, and communities relied on watchmen to guard their sleeping neighborhoods. Because of these conditions, medieval people adapted their routines carefully. Work was organized around daylight, travel was planned to end before sunset, and homes were designed to provide protection during the night. Even social life tended to follow this pattern, with most gatherings ending before the streets became completely dark. At the same time, night also carried a certain mystery. The sky full of stars, the soft glow of moonlight across fields, and the quiet stillness of sleeping villages created a world that was very different from the busy daylight hours. People living in that era were more connected to these natural rhythms because they experienced them directly every day. For the few who found themselves outside after dark, whether watchmen, travellers, bakers, monks, or late workers, the night revealed a hidden side of medieval life. It was quieter, slower, and often more uncertain. But it was also a reminder of how communities relied on cooperation and routine to remain safe until the return of the sun. When dawn finally arrived, and sunlight spread across rooftops and fields, The shadows disappeared, and the ordinary rhythm of medieval life resumed once again. The dangers and uncertainties of the night faded into memory, replaced by the familiar sounds of people working, trading, and living under the bright light of a new day. Even as dawn approached, and the darkness slowly loosened its hold over the land, the medieval night still carried a lingering tension. The faint grey light appearing on the horizon did not immediately transform the world back into its daytime form. For a while, the land existed in a strange half-light where shapes were visible, but not fully clear. Trees, walls, and rooftops appeared as dark outlines against the growing brightness of the sky. If someone had spent the night outside, this period could feel like a quiet transition between two worlds. The silent uncertainty of night and the predictable routine of morning. During these early moments, the sounds of life slowly returned. One of the first noises to break the silence might be the movement of animals. Horses in stables shifted their weight, cows stirred in their enclosures, and chickens began rustling inside their coops. Farmers often rose early to care for their animals, and the creak of stable doors or the clatter of wooden buckets could sometimes be heard even before sunrise. These sounds were small but significant because they marked the end of the night's isolation. For someone who had been outside throughout the darkness, the emotional shift brought by the first light was powerful. The same road that had seemed uncertain and possibly dangerous a few hours earlier suddenly appeared familiar again. Landmarks such as trees, fences, and distant hills gradually became visible. With each passing minute, the sense of vulnerability faded as daylight spread across the landscape. However, medieval people did not view night simply as an inconvenience. In many ways, it was a natural and accepted part of life. Because artificial lighting was limited and expensive, societies adapted to the cycle of daylight and darkness. People structured their routines carefully around the rising and setting of the sun. Farmers worked in fields during daylight hours, craftsmen used sunlight to complete detailed tasks, and merchants conducted trade when markets were most active during the day. Once darkness arrived, the pace of life slowed dramatically. Families gathered inside their homes where the hearth provided warmth and a small amount of light. Candles or oil lamps might be used sparingly, but these were valuable items that people tried not to waste. Instead of continuing work late into the night, many households used the evening hours for conversation, storytelling, prayer, or quiet preparation for sleep. This pattern created a rhythm that was very different from modern life. Today, cities remain active at all hours, illuminated by electric lights that make night almost indistinguishable from day. In medieval times, however, the darkness truly marked the end of daily activity for most people. The world outside their doors became quieter, slower, and more unpredictable. For travelers and messengers, the return of daylight was especially important. Many journeys began very early in the morning to take full advantage of the available sunlight. Roads were easier to follow when landmarks were clearly visible, and travelers could better avoid hazards such as deep mud, broken bridges, or hidden obstacles. Inns and taverns that had been silent during the night began opening their doors again, offering food and rest to people continuing their journeys. In towns, markets also began preparing for the day. Merchants carried goods into open squares. Farmers arrived with carts of vegetables or grain, and craftsmen displayed items they had produced. the same streets that had been empty and shadowy during the night, filled with voices and movement. For someone who had experienced those streets in complete darkness, the transformation could feel remarkable. Church bells often played a role in signaling the beginning of the day. Their sound travelled across villages and towns, announcing morning prayers or marking the start of daily activities. As daylight finally spread across the horizon and the long night faded away, people who had been outside during the darkness often felt a sense of relief that was difficult to describe. In medieval society, sunrise represented more than just the beginning of another day. It symbolized safety returning to the world. The sun's light revealed everything that darkness had hidden. Roads became easier to follow. Buildings regained their familiar shapes, and the quiet uncertainty of night gave way to the lively energy of daytime activity. During the final stretch of night before sunrise, the atmosphere outside often felt heavy and slow. The air was cold, and mist sometimes formed over fields or along rivers. If someone was travelling through the countryside, they might see fog drifting across the ground, making the landscape appear mysterious and slightly unreal. Shapes in the distance could look distorted, and even a small hill or cluster of trees might appear like something unfamiliar. These visual tricks were common when the human eye struggled to interpret objects in weak light. Travellers who had stayed on the road throughout the night often moved cautiously during these moments. Horses walked slowly, carts creaked over uneven ground, and travellers listened carefully to their surroundings. The faint sound of water flowing in a stream or the rustling of wind through trees could help someone understand where they were. Medieval travellers often relied on such natural clues when navigating through unfamiliar territory. In villages, the first signs of morning gradually brought life back to the streets. Smoke began rising from chimneys as families rekindled their hearth fires. The smell of wood burning mixed with the cool morning air. Doors opened slowly as people stepped outside to begin their daily routines. Farmers walked toward their fields carrying tools, and stable doors creaked open as animals were released or fed. The transformation between night and morning was especially noticeable in market towns. At night these towns might appear almost abandoned, with closed shutters and silent streets. But as dawn approached, activity increased quickly. Merchants arranged goods, carts rolled into town carrying produce, and workers began preparing for another day of trade. The same streets that had felt lonely and uncertain during the night suddenly became crowded with voices, movement, and colour. For someone who had spent the night outside, whether travelling, working, or simply unable to find shelter, the return of this activity could feel comforting. Being surrounded by other people again meant that help and safety were close by. Darkness no longer concealed dangers, and strangers could easily be seen and identified. Yet, even though morning restored normal life, the memory of nighttime conditions remained strong in the minds of medieval people. Generations had grown up understanding that darkness changed the world in important ways. Stories passed through communities often warned about the risks of wandering outside after sunset. Parents told children to return home before dark, and travellers were advised to reach inns or safe lodging before nightfall whenever possible. The night also played a role in shaping medieval laws and customs. Curfews were not simply rules for controlling people, They were practical measures designed to protect communities by encouraging residents to stay indoors after dark. Authorities reduced opportunities for crime and accidents. When fewer people were moving through the streets, watchmen could more easily notice suspicious activity. These curfews also helped prevent fires, which were among the greatest dangers in medieval towns, because candles and open flames were common sources of light. Accidents could easily occur if people stayed awake and active late into the night. By encouraging households to extinguish or cover their fires before sleeping, communities tried to reduce the chance of devastating nighttime blazes. Another interesting aspect of medieval nighttime life was the way people adjusted their sleeping habits. In some historical records, there are hints that many people practiced what historians sometimes call segmented sleep. Instead of sleeping continuously for 8 hours, some individuals slept for a few hours, woke briefly during the night, and then returned to sleep again until morning. During these quiet waking periods, people might pray, think, or quietly talk with family members before going back to bed. This pattern shows how closely medieval life was connected to natural cycles. Without bright artificial lighting, human routines followed the rhythm of the sun and moon much more directly than they do today. Darkness encouraged rest, while daylight encouraged activity and productivity. Despite the many challenges associated with nighttime, there were also moments when the darkness created opportunities. Certain tasks were easier to perform when the world was quiet. Guards patrolled the streets without distraction. Monks carried out midnight prayers, and early workers prepared food or supplies for the coming day. The stillness of night allowed these activities to take place without interruption. Occasionally, nighttime events left lasting impressions on communities. A mysterious figure seen walking through the streets, an unexpected fire discovered by watchmen, or a traveller arriving with urgent news could become stories repeated for years. Because the night was usually quiet, unusual events stood out more strongly and were remembered more vividly. The medieval relationship with darkness was therefore complex. On one hand, it was associated with uncertainty, danger, and vulnerability. On the other hand, it was a natural and necessary part of life that shaped daily rhythms and traditions. People learned to respect the night rather than challenge it. When the sun finally rose high above the horizon and daylight fully filled the streets and fields, the memory of nighttime fears faded into the background. The world felt open and manageable again. Farmers could see their crops clearly. Craftsmen could work with precision, and travelers could navigate roads without fear of hidden obstacles. But everyone knew that as evening approached, the cycle would begin again. The sun would set, shadows would lengthen across the land, and towns would slowly grow quiet. Doors would close, fires would be tended carefully, and watchmen would prepare to walk through the dark streets once more. In this way, medieval people lived within a constant rhythm shaped by the movement of light and darkness. Being outside after dark meant stepping into a world where visibility, safety, and certainty were reduced. It required caution, patience, and awareness of one's surroundings. For most people, the safest place to be during those hours was inside their homes, waiting for the next sunrise to restore the familiar and lively world of daylight once again. Even after the sun had fully risen and the town returned to life, The experience of the previous night often remained in the minds of those who had been outside. Medieval people lived in a world where darkness carried meaning. It was not simply the absence of light, but a time when the structure of society temporarily changed. Streets that had been lively during the day became quiet corridors of shadow. Familiar places took on a different atmosphere, and ordinary tasks became more difficult. During the night, the limits of human vision shaped every movement. A person walking with a torch or lantern could only see a small circle of light around them. Everything beyond that glow remained hidden in darkness. This meant that anyone travelling at night had to move slowly and carefully. A sudden step into a puddle, a loose stone underfoot, or an unexpected obstacle could easily cause injury. In towns with cobbled streets or uneven pathways, it was easy to trip if one was not paying close attention. Outside towns, the experience was even more challenging. Medieval roads were rarely straight or smooth. Many were simple dirt tracks formed by years of travel rather than carefully designed routes. In darkness, these roads could disappear entirely, especially if they crossed fields or forests. Travellers sometimes followed natural features such as rivers, tree lines, or hills to keep their direction. But if clouds covered the moon and stars, even these clues became difficult to see. The medieval countryside at night could feel vast and isolating. Without artificial lights in the distance, a traveller might see nothing but darkness stretching across fields and woods. The silence of these places could feel peaceful at first, but it could also create a sense of loneliness. Every sound carried far through the quiet night air. The snapping of a branch or the rustle of leaves might cause someone to pause and listen carefully, wondering whether the noise came from an animal, another traveller, or something else. Villagers and travellers alike developed habits to deal with these conditions. Many people carried small lanterns when they needed to move outside after sunset. These lanterns were often made from metal frames with thin coverings that protected the flame from wind. However, the light they produced was limited, and the fuel needed to keep them burning was not always cheap. Because of this, lanterns were used sparingly, and usually only when necessary. Another precaution people took was moving in groups whenever possible. A group of travellers could watch out for each other, share light sources, and provide protection if trouble appeared. Merchants and pilgrims sometimes formed temporary groups when travelling between towns, so they would not have to face the dangers of the road alone. Inside towns, the presence of walls and gates added another layer of security, but also created complications for anyone outside after dark. Even after centuries, historians trying to understand medieval life often point out that night divided the day into two very different worlds. Daytime belonged to work, trade, farming, and public activity. Nighttime belonged to quiet, rest, and caution. When the sun disappeared below the horizon, medieval communities slowly withdrew into their homes, leaving the outside world to darkness. A few watchmen, and the occasional traveller still moving along the road. For someone who found themselves outside after dark, the environment could feel strangely unfamiliar. During the day, streets were full of colour, movement and noise. Vendors called out to customers, carts rolled over stone roads, and children ran through alleyways. But at night, those same places felt almost empty. Houses closed their shutters, doors were barred, and the voices that had filled the streets disappeared. This sudden quietness often made a person feel more exposed. When many people were awake, there was safety in numbers. If trouble happened, someone nearby could help, or at least witness what was happening. At night, however, fewer people were around. Anyone walking through the streets might feel as though they were alone in a large sleeping town. The darkness also affected how buildings appeared. Medieval towns were often built in daylight. These structures looked ordinary and practical. At night, with only faint light from a lantern or torch, they cast long shadows across the ground. A simple wooden beam or doorway could create dark shapes that moved as the light flickered. Because of this, many people felt uneasy walking through town after dark. Even those who knew the streets, sometimes felt disoriented. Corners that were easy to recognize during the day became harder to identify when hidden in shadow. A familiar path could suddenly feel confusing if a lantern went out or clouds covered the moon. The medieval relationship with darkness was also shaped by the limits of technology. Lighting tools were simple and not always reliable. Torches could burn quickly and produce smoke. Candles were expensive and often reserved for indoor use. Oil lamps existed but required fuel that not everyone could afford to waste. As a result, people were careful about how and when they used light. In many towns, carrying a lantern at night was sometimes expected, especially if someone needed to walk through the streets after curfew. Without a visible light source, a person might appear suspicious to guards or watchmen. A lantern made it easier for others to see that someone was approaching and reduced the risk of being mistaken for a criminal. The watchmen themselves often relied on simple equipment. They carried lanterns to illuminate their path, and sometimes small weapons such as clubs or spears. For protection, their job was not only to watch for thieves, but also to prevent fires, which could spread quickly through wooden buildings. If a watchman noticed smoke or flames, he would shout loudly to alert residents and gather help. Night also affected how people perceived time. Without clocks in most homes, people relied on natural cues to estimate the passing hours. The position of the moon, the brightness of the stars, or the gradual cooling of the air could give hints about how late it was. In towns with churches, bells sometimes rang during the night to mark certain hours. These sounds travelling through the darkness helped remind people that time was still moving forward even while the town slept. Hearing a bell in the distance could reassure someone outside that morning was getting closer. For travellers walking along long roads between towns, the night sometimes felt endless. The same stretch of road could seem longer than it did during the day because visibility was limited. A traveller might stop frequently to listen, rest, or check their direction. If they were lucky enough to travel under a bright moon, the journey could be easier. But during cloudy nights, movement became much more difficult. Some travellers used the stars as guides, especially when crossing open fields or hills. Certain constellations helped indicate direction, and experienced travellers learned to recognize them. However, this method required clear skies and familiarity with the night sky. Despite these difficulties, nighttime travel sometimes had advantages. Cooler temperatures made long journeys less exhausting during hot seasons. Roads were quieter, with fewer carts and crowds blocking the way. Messengers carrying urgent news occasionally travelled through the night to deliver information as quickly as possible. Still, most people preferred to avoid unnecessary travel after sunset. The risks simply outweighed the benefits for ordinary villagers or merchants. Reaching an inn before dark was usually the safest option. In rural areas, the darkness of night often felt deeper than it did in towns. Villages were surrounded by fields, forests, and open land. Without the protection of walls or gates, villagers depended on strong community bonds to maintain safety. Neighbours kept watch over each other's homes and animals, and any unusual activity was quickly noticed. Dogs often played an important role in nighttime security. Their barking alerted households to strangers approaching the village. Even a traveller passing quietly along the road might cause several dogs to start barking, waking nearby residents. Inside homes, families tried to make the night as comfortable as possible. After finishing evening tasks, they gathered near the hearth where warmth and light created a peaceful environment. Stories were shared, simple meals were eaten, and preparations for sleep were made once everyone settled in. The house became a small refuge against the darkness outside. Thick doors, shutters, and walls created a barrier between the sleeping family and the uncertain world beyond. When morning eventually arrived, the contrast between night and day became clear once again. Light filled the streets, shadows disappeared, and the sounds of daily life returned. The same places that had felt quiet and mysterious a few hours earlier now looked ordinary and welcoming. This daily cycle shaped medieval life in profound ways. People respected the limits that darkness placed on their activities and structured their routines accordingly. Night was a time to rest, reflect, and remain cautious. For anyone who had to step outside after dark, the experience served as a reminder of how much the world depended on sunlight. Without it, familiar surroundings could quickly become uncertain. Yet as dawn always followed night, people trusted that the safety and clarity of daylight would return again, bringing with it the lively rhythm of medieval life once more. As the medieval night stretched across the land, it created a rhythm that people had learned to respect over generations. Darkness was not simply something that happened after sunset. It was a condition that reshaped the entire environment. The absence of widespread lighting meant that once the sun disappeared, the world outside homes changed into a place of uncertainty where caution became essential. Anyone stepping outside after dark entered a landscape where visibility was limited, help was far away, and every sound seemed louder than usual. For people living in towns, the streets themselves contributed to this sense of unease. Medieval streets were often narrow, twisting between tightly packed houses built from wood or stone. During the day, sunlight illuminated these passages, revealing their familiar shapes and textures. But at night, even a small amount of darkness could transform them into long corridors of shadow. A lantern held in someone's hand might reveal the ground directly ahead, but everything beyond that small circle of light remained hidden. This limited visibility forced people to move slowly. Someone walking too quickly risked colliding with obstacles or slipping on wet stones. Rainwater sometimes collected in shallow depressions along the street, and refuse from animals or daily activity could make the ground slippery. Because sanitation systems were primitive, medieval streets were not always clean, and stepping into something unpleasant in the darkness was common. Outside the town walls, the landscape was even more unpredictable. Roads passing through forests or fields were rarely maintained with the precision of modern highways. They were shaped by years of travel rather than careful design. Ruts created by wagon wheels, fallen branches, and uneven ground could all become hazards when hidden in darkness. Travelers who had to continue their journeys after sunset often relied heavily on memory and instinct. If they had traveled the same road before, they might remember certain landmarks, such as a distinctive tree, a bend in a river, or the outline of a hill. These features helped them stay on the correct path, even when visibility was poor. Sometimes travelers paused and waited for their eyes to adjust to the darkness. Human vision gradually becomes more sensitive when exposed to low light, allowing faint shapes to become visible. Medieval people were more accustomed to this adaptation because they lived without bright artificial lights. After a few minutes in darkness, they could often see enough to continue moving carefully. Despite these adaptations, the risks of nighttime travel remained real. Criminals sometimes took advantage of the darkness to hide along isolated roads. A traveler carrying goods or money could become a target if they were alone. This is why merchants often preferred to travel in groups or join caravans. Multiple travelers could watch for danger and defend each other if necessary. The possibility of being questioned by authorities also added to the tension of nighttime movement. Town guards or watchmen were responsible for maintaining order. As the medieval night continued hour after hour, the world outside remained in a kind of suspended quiet that modern people rarely experience. With almost everyone asleep and very little light in the streets, the outside environment became a place where even the smallest detail felt significant. A single lantern moving slowly through the darkness could be seen from far away, and a distant sound might echo through the empty streets or across open countryside. For someone standing outside during those late hours, the senses naturally became sharper. Because vision was limited, people relied more on hearing and instinct. The sound of footsteps, the creaking of wooden doors, or the distant movement of animals became important clues about what was happening nearby. Medieval people were used to this heightened awareness because they lived in a world where darkness was common and unavoidable. In towns, the layout of buildings often made nighttime travel even more challenging. Many streets were narrow and irregular, shaped by centuries of construction rather than careful planning. Some houses leaned slightly over the street, creating overhangs that blocked moonlight and made certain areas darker than others. Walking through these spaces with only a lantern could feel like moving through a tunnel of shadow. If someone approached a crossroads or small square, the open space might suddenly feel strangely large after walking through tight alleys. Moonlight could illuminate these open areas more clearly, allowing a traveller to see the outlines of buildings, wells, or public structures such as fountains and market stalls. These locations sometimes became temporary resting points for anyone moving through the town at night. Outside the towns, medieval landscapes were often dominated by farmland and forests. Fields stretched across large areas with little human presence during the night. A traveller moving along a country road might pass silent barns, empty farmyards, and dark tree lines without seeing another person for hours. The quietness of these places could feel both peaceful and intimidating. Forests in particular carried a strong reputation during medieval times. Dense trees blocked moonlight and made the interior of the forest extremely dark at night. Even experienced travelers hesitated to pass through wooded areas after sunset unless absolutely necessary. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches underfoot, or the distant calls of animals could create an atmosphere that felt unpredictable. Because forests were difficult to patrol, they sometimes became hiding places for criminals or outlaws. Stories of highway robbers waiting along forest roads circulated widely in medieval society. Whether these stories were always accurate or not, they reinforced the belief that traveling through such areas at night was risky. Villagers living near forests often warned travelers to finish their journeys before darkness, if their route required crossing wooded terrain. If a traveler reached the forest edge too late, they might choose to wait until morning rather than enter the trees in darkness. Another factor that made nighttime difficult was weather. Without strong lighting or paved roads, rain or fog could quickly transform a simple journey into a complicated challenge. Heavy rain turned dirt roads into thick mud that slowed carts and horses. Fog reduced visibility so much that travelers sometimes lost sight of the road entirely. Wind also played a role. A strong gust could extinguish a torch or lantern, leaving a traveler suddenly surrounded by darkness. Relighting the flame required time and resources, and during those moments a person might feel particularly vulnerable. Despite these challenges, medieval people occasionally experienced moments of calm beauty during the night. On clear evenings when the moon was full, landscapes appeared in soft silver light. Rivers reflected the moon's glow, and fields looked almost peaceful under the quiet sky. The stars were incredibly bright because there was no artificial light to obscure them. Many people living in that era were familiar with constellations and could recognize patterns in the sky. These patterns helped travelers orient themselves, and also played a role in agricultural traditions and seasonal awareness. Yet even during these peaceful moments, most people remained cautious. The beauty of the night sky did not remove the practical difficulties of darkness. Roads were still hard to see, help was still distant, and the possibility of unexpected danger remained. Because of this, medieval communities built social systems designed to protect people during nighttime hours. Curfews limited unnecessary movement. Watchmen patrolled the streets, and town gates were closed to prevent unknown individuals from entering. These measures reduced risk and helped maintain order while residents slept. Within homes, the atmosphere was very different from the outside world. The glow of the hearth created warmth and light that contrasted sharply with the darkness beyond the walls. Families often spent their final waking hours talking quietly, repairing tools, or preparing food for the next day. Stories were an important part of these evenings. Tales about travelers, heroic figures, strange events, or local legends were shared from one generation to another. In many cases, these stories reflected the experiences people had with nighttime travel or unexpected encounters in dark places. After a while, the fire burned lower and people prepared for sleep. Beds were often simple and shared by family members to conserve warmth. Once everyone settled down, the house became silent, except for the occasional crackling of embers in the hearth. Outside, the watchmen continued their slow patrols. Their lanterns moved from street to street as they checked doors and listened for unusual sounds. If everything remained quiet, the night passed without incident. Eventually, the sky began to change color again as dawn approached. The first pale light appeared along the horizon, gradually pushing away the darkness that had dominated the landscape for hours. Birds began to stir, animals moved in their enclosures, and the first signs of human activity returned. For anyone who had remained outside throughout the night, this moment often felt like a release. The environment that had seemed uncertain and mysterious slowly became familiar again. Roads became visible, buildings regained their shape, and the world once again felt manageable. The cycle repeated every day in medieval life. Darkness arrived with sunset and brought caution, quiet, and limited movement. Then morning restored activity, safety, and community interaction. Because of this rhythm, medieval people developed a deep respect for the night. They understood that it was not a time for ordinary activity, but a period when the world changed and required patience and awareness. Being outside after dark meant entering a different version of the same world, one where silence was deeper, shadows were longer, and every step required careful attention until the reassuring light of morning returned. As the night moved toward its deepest hours, the medieval world often felt as though it had completely withdrawn into silence. Most fires inside homes had burned low. Streets were empty, and the only consistent movement came from the occasional watchman making his rounds. For anyone outside during this time, the experience could feel almost surreal. The familiar environment of the daytime world seemed to fade away, replaced by something quieter, darker, and far more uncertain. In medieval towns, the architecture itself contributed to the strange atmosphere of nighttime. Houses were often built very close together, and upper floors sometimes extended slightly over the streets. During the day, this created shade and shelter from weather. But at night it made the streets darker and narrower. Moonlight struggled to reach the ground, leaving long stretches of shadow between buildings. If someone carried a lantern through these streets, the flame cast a trembling glow on stone walls and wooden doors. Every movement caused shadows to stretch and shift along the ground. A person might briefly see their own shadow growing tall against a wall, then shrinking again as they walked forward. In such dim conditions, the mind sometimes played tricks, making ordinary shapes appear unfamiliar. Sounds also behaved differently at night. Without the constant noise of daily activity, even small sounds travelled far. The closing of a door, the clatter of a loose piece of wood, or the footsteps of a guard could echo through empty streets. Someone walking alone might hear noises from several houses away and feel unsure about their origin. For this reason, medieval people were often very aware of their surroundings during the night. Anyone moving outside had to pay attention to both what they could see and what they could hear. The environment demanded caution, and most people learned to move carefully rather than rush through the darkness. In rural areas, the contrast between day and night was even stronger. Villages surrounded by open land became almost completely dark once the sun set. Without large buildings or streetlights, the countryside turned into a vast, shadowy landscape. Fields that were bright and lively during the day disappeared into darkness, and distant hills became barely visible silhouettes against the sky. Travellers moving through such areas relied heavily on natural light. A bright moon could illuminate the ground enough to follow a path. But on cloudy nights, the darkness could feel overwhelming. If someone lost their way, it might take hours to find the correct road again. Because of this, travelers often planned their journeys carefully. They tried to reach villages, inns, or monasteries before sunset so they could rest safely. As the medieval night continued hour by hour, the world outside homes often felt as though it had slowed to a near standstill. Without the activity of markets, workshops, and farms, the landscape became quiet in a way that modern cities rarely experience. For anyone outside during these hours, the silence itself could feel unusual. The absence of everyday sounds, hammering, talking, animals moving through busy streets, made even small noises stand out sharply against the stillness. If someone walked through a town at night, their footsteps might echo faintly along stone streets. The sound of boots or sandals striking the ground could bounce off the walls of nearby buildings. Because most homes were closed and dark, those sounds sometimes seemed louder than they actually were. Anyone awake inside might notice them, and briefly wonder who was moving outside at such a late hour. This is one reason why people often felt self-conscious walking through medieval streets after dark. Even if they had a legitimate reason to be outside, the quiet surroundings made their presence very noticeable. A traveller, messenger, or late worker might feel as though the entire sleeping town could hear them passing by. Light played a powerful role in shaping how nighttime looked and felt. When someone carried a lantern or torch, the flame created a small pool of brightness surrounded by deep darkness. Objects within that circle were clearly visible, but everything beyond it faded into shadow. As the lantern moved, the light shifted constantly, causing walls, barrels, and doorways to appear and disappear from view. This moving light created a strange visual experience. Shadows stretched across the ground and climbed up the sides of buildings. A simple wooden cart parked along the street might look much larger when its shadow was cast against a wall. Because of this, nighttime scenes often appeared dramatic and unfamiliar compared to the calm appearance of daylight. In rural villages, the effect could be even stronger. Without tall buildings to block the sky, moonlight sometimes illuminated open spaces such as fields or farmyards. The pale light reflected off grass, water, or stone, giving the landscape a soft silver tone. People living in that era often became accustomed to recognizing shapes in moonlight and could navigate familiar areas more easily than someone unfamiliar with the environment. However, moonlight was not always reliable. Clouds could hide the moon entirely, turning the countryside into deep darkness. On such nights, travelers relied almost completely on their own light sources, or simply waited until morning before continuing their journey. The medieval night was also closely tied to seasonal changes. During winter months, darkness arrived early and lasted for many hours. Cold temperatures made being outside especially uncomfortable. Travelers who were caught on the road after sunset often struggled against freezing air and strong winds. Snow sometimes reflected faint light from the moon or stars, making the landscape slightly easier to see. But icy roads could be dangerous for both horses and carts. For villagers, winter nights meant spending long periods indoors, relying on stored food and the warmth of hearth fires. Summer nights, on the other hand, were shorter and often calmer. Warm air and clear skies created conditions where people might stay awake slightly longer during the evening. Even then, however, most activity still ended soon after sunset because lighting was limited. An unknown group of people who sometimes remained awake through the night were guards stationed at castles or town gates. Their responsibility was to remain alert while others slept. Guards stood watch along walls or towers, scanning the surrounding area for signs of movement. From these high positions they could see torchlight approaching from distant roads, or hear unusual sounds travelling across the countryside. These guards relied heavily on discipline and routine. Remaining awake for long hours in darkness required concentration, and losing focus could allow danger to approach unnoticed. Communication between guards was important, and signals such as horns or bells could quickly alert others if something unusual appeared. Monasteries also followed nighttime routines that differed from ordinary households. Monks often woke during the night to perform prayers or chants as part of their religious schedule. In the quiet halls of a monastery, candles illuminated stone corridors, while voices echoed softly through chapels. These nighttime prayers reflected the spiritual importance many people placed on the quiet hours before dawn. For monks, the stillness of night provided an opportunity for reflection and devotion away from the distractions of daily work. Meanwhile, ordinary households experienced the night in a simpler way. Families gathered near the hearth until they felt tired enough to sleep. Because candles and oil lamps were valuable, they were often extinguished once everyone settled into bed. The glow of embers in the fireplace sometimes remained as the only source of light. During sleep, houses became silent, except for the occasional sound of shifting wood in the fire or wind moving outside. Thick wooden doors and shutters helped block cold air and unwanted visitors, creating a sense of safety inside the home. Outside, the watchmen continued their patrols, walking slowly through streets that had fallen completely quiet. Their lanterns moved through the darkness like small floating lights, appearing briefly in one part of the street before disappearing around the next corner. Most nights passed peacefully in this way, with no disturbances and no emergencies. The town slept, the watchmen watched, and the stars moved slowly across the sky. Eventually the sky began to change as dawn approached. A faint light appeared along the horizon, gradually spreading across the land. Birds began to call, animals stirred, and the first early risers stepped outside to begin their work. The arrival of daylight transformed everything. Streets that had seemed mysterious during the night looked ordinary again. The same doors, wells, carts, and houses appeared familiar and harmless in the sunlight. Markets reopened. Travellers resumed their journeys, and farmers walked toward their fields. The quiet tension that had surrounded the town during the night disappeared, as life returned to its usual pace. For medieval people, this daily transition from darkness to light was one of the most reliable rhythms of existence. Night brought stillness, caution, and rest, while morning restored activity, community, and safety. Anion, who had been outside after dark, understood how different the world could feel when sunlight vanished. Shadows grew deeper, sounds became sharper, and even familiar places seemed unfamiliar. Yet the promise of sunrise remained constant, reminding people that the quiet and uncertainty of night would always give way to the warmth and clarity of a new day. As the medieval night carried on toward its quietest hours, the world outside homes felt almost detached from ordinary life. darkness did not simply hide the landscape. It altered how people experienced it. The absence of light removed the details that usually helped people understand their surroundings. Shapes became vague silhouettes, and distances became harder to judge. A building that appeared small during the day might look much larger when seen only as a dark outline against the sky. For someone outside after dark, walking even a short distance required patience. The safest approach was to move slowly, testing the ground with each step. Uneven stones, shallow holes, or scattered debris could cause someone to stumble if they were not careful. In towns, narrow streets sometimes contained waste from animals or leftover materials from daily work, which could be unpleasant to step into when unseen. People who lived during this time developed a strong familiarity with their environment because of these conditions. They memorized the layout of streets, the location of wells, gates, and public buildings, and the paths leading to fields or nearby villages. This knowledge helped them navigate even when visibility was limited. Yet even the most familiar place could feel different at night. A courtyard that seemed lively during the day might appear strangely empty after sunset. The outlines of carts, barrels, and tools stored outside houses could look unusual in shifting lantern light. Shadows moved with every flicker of flame, giving the impression that the surroundings were constantly changing. The psychological effect of darkness played a significant role in how people behaved at night. Humans naturally feel less secure when they cannot see clearly, and this instinct was especially strong in a world without reliable lighting. Medieval people understood that darkness reduced their ability to react quickly to danger. Because of this, they placed great importance on closing their homes securely before nightfall. Doors were barred with wooden beams, shutters were latched tightly, and animals were brought inside protective enclosures. These routines were repeated every evening and became an essential part of daily life. In larger towns and cities, gates built into the surrounding walls provided another layer of security. These gates were closed at night to control who entered and left the town. Guards stationed at these entrances watched the roads and kept track of any movement near the walls. For travelers who arrived late, the closed gates could present a difficult situation. If the guards refused entry, travelers might have to remain outside until morning. Some waited quietly near the gate, hoping to be admitted once daylight returned. Others searched for nearby farms or small shelters where they could rest for a few hours. As the medieval night continued to unfold, the sense of separation between the sleeping world and the outside darkness became even more noticeable. Inside homes, families rested behind thick doors and shuttered windows, sheltered by walls that blocked the wind and the cold air of the night. Outside those walls, however, the environment felt far less secure. Darkness covered the streets and countryside like a blanket, hiding both harmless objects and potential dangers alike. For someone walking outside at night, one of the most striking experiences was how limited their vision became. Human eyes rely heavily on light to recognize shapes and distances. Without it, the brain fills in gaps with guesses and imagination. A pile of firewood stacked near a house might resemble a crouching figure at first glance. A broken fence post sticking out of the ground could appear like a person standing still. These small visual confusions were common in the dim glow of lanterns or moonlight. Because of this, people often paused frequently while walking at night. They stopped to look carefully at shapes ahead, trying to determine whether what they saw was harmless or something worth avoiding. Medieval travellers quickly learned that moving slowly and cautiously was far safer than rushing forward blindly. The feeling of vulnerability also came from the fact that help was rarely nearby during the night. During the day, a person could easily call out to neighbours, merchants, or farmers working nearby. At night, however, most people were asleep behind closed doors. Even if someone shouted for help, it might take time before anyone heard or responded. This was another reason why people preferred to stay indoors once darkness arrived. Inside their homes, they could rely on familiar surroundings and the protection of family members. Outside, they were more exposed to whatever the night might bring. In towns, the role of watchmen became particularly important during these hours. These men were responsible for walking through the streets while others slept. Their lanterns provided small points of moving light in the darkness as they checked doorways, alleyways, and quiet corners. Watchmen often followed regular paths through the town so that no area remained unchecked for too long. Their footsteps and occasional calls were among the few signs that someone was awake outside during the night. For residents listening from inside their homes, these sounds offered reassurance that the town was being protected. At the same time, the watchmen themselves had to remain alert. If they noticed a door forced open, a suspicious figure hiding near a building, or smoke rising from a rooftop, they needed to react quickly. Their warnings could prevent crimes or disasters before they grew worse. Beyond the town walls, nighttime created an entirely different atmosphere. The countryside was vast and open, with far fewer signs of human presence. Fields stretched into darkness, and forests stood like silent walls of shadow. Travellers crossing such landscapes sometimes relied on natural sounds to orient themselves. The flow of a river, the chirping of insects, or the rustling of wind through tall grass could help them understand where they were. But these same sounds could also create unease if the traveller did not know their source. Animals were often more active at night than during the day. Owls flew silently through the air, searching for prey, while foxes or other small creatures moved quietly along the edges of fields. For someone unfamiliar with these sounds, the night could feel full of unseen movement. In some regions, wolves were still present during medieval times, particularly in forested areas. Although attacks on humans were rare, the possibility added another reason for travellers to avoid lonely roads after dark. Hearing a distant howl echo through the trees could remind a traveller just how isolated they were. Despite these concerns, the medieval night was not always threatening. In fact, many people who spent time outside during calm evenings described the landscape as peaceful and beautiful. Without the noise of markets and busy streets, the world felt quiet and still. The sky in particular was far more visible than it is today. Without modern city lights, stars appeared brilliant and countless. People could easily see patterns of constellations stretching across the sky. The moon illuminated rivers, rooftops, and fields with a soft glow that gave the land a dreamlike quality. For travellers moving slowly under such skies, the night could feel almost magical. Yet even in these moments of beauty, caution remained necessary. A peaceful scene could change quickly, if weather shifted or if a traveller lost their way. Inside homes, meanwhile, the night followed its own gentle rhythm. Families finished their evening meals, spoke quietly together, and gradually prepared for sleep. The hearth fire provided the main source of warmth and light. Its flickering glow illuminated wooden furniture, stone walls, and simple household tools. Before going to bed, people often made sure that everything was in order. Fires were covered safely, doors were secured, and animals were checked once more. These small routines helped create a sense of security before the long hours of darkness. Once the household settled into sleep, the outside world seemed even quieter by comparison. Only the occasional patrol of a watchman or the distant call of an animal disturbed the silence. As the night slowly approached its end, subtle changes began to appear. The sky lightened slightly along the horizon, and the stars gradually faded. Birds began to stir, and their early songs signaled that morning was near. The first people to wake were often farmers and workers who needed to start their tasks early. Soon afterward, doors opened, and smoke began rising from chimneys as fires were rekindled for cooking and warmth. The transformation from night to day was always striking. Streets that had felt mysterious and uncertain during the night quickly filled with familiar activity. Voices returned, carts rolled across the roads, and the ordinary rhythm of life resumed. For medieval people, this cycle was part of everyday existence. Darkness brought a period of rest, caution, and quiet observation, while daylight restored safety, productivity, and social life. Anion, who had been outside after dark, understood just how different the world could feel without sunlight. Yet they also knew that the night was temporary. No matter how long or quiet it seemed, dawn would eventually arrive, bringing with it the reassuring light that allowed medieval life to begin again. As the night deepened further in medieval times, the outside world often felt as if it had been paused. Without lamps lining the streets or lights glowing from every building, the darkness became a dominant presence. Only small islands of light existed, perhaps from a lantern carried by a watchman, a torch near a gate, or a faint glow escaping through the cracks of a shuttered window. Everything else remained hidden in shadow. For someone walking outside during these hours, the experience could feel strangely isolating. Even in a town with hundreds or thousands of people, the streets might seem empty and silent. The knowledge that everyone else was asleep behind closed doors made the outside world feel abandoned, as though the traveller had stepped into a different version of the town. Movement through such darkness required careful attention. A person might pause frequently, listening before turning a corner or entering a narrow alley. Since sound travelled farther in the quiet night air, someone approaching could sometimes be heard before they were seen. The faint scrape of boots on stone or the jingle of metal from a belt could reveal another person's presence long before their face appeared in the lantern light. In many places, the night watch had a routine that repeated every evening. Watchmen walked through specific streets, checking gates, doors, and quiet areas. Some carried long staffs that they tapped lightly on the ground as they walked. This sound served a practical purpose. It warned anyone nearby that the watch was present and alert. A thief or troublemaker hearing the staff strike the ground might decide to move away rather than risk confrontation. These patrols were often organized by local communities. In smaller villages, residents sometimes took turns, performing the watch duty themselves. Each household might be required to contribute a night of patrol during the month. This system helped ensure that everyone shared responsibility for keeping the village safe. The night also influenced how medieval people thought about time. Without modern clocks visible everywhere, people measured the passing hours differently. Some relied on church bells that rang at specific intervals during the night. Others estimated the time by observing the position of the moon or certain stars. For travelers on the road, the stars could serve as guides across open land. Familiar constellations helped indicate direction, especially in areas where the road was not clearly visible. Sailors at sea relied even more heavily on these celestial patterns, using them to navigate across vast stretches of water. But even with these natural guides, darkness still limited how far a person could safely travel. Horses moved more cautiously at night, and wagon wheels could easily strike hidden rocks or holes in the road. Because of this, merchants and traders generally tried to reach their destinations before sunset whenever possible. If a journey took longer than expected, travelers searched for shelter before nightfall. Inns, monasteries, and roadside shelters offered protection from both weather and potential dangers. Inside these buildings, travelers found warmth, food, and the company of others who were also on the road.